I want to tell you something that most people who were there that day still don't talk about. Not because it's classified, most of it isn't, not anymore, but because admitting what you witnessed means admitting how wrong you were, how wrong almost everyone was. And that's a hard thing to put into words when you spent 15 years believing a certain version of the galaxy. See, I was there, standing maybe 12 meters back, near the secondary observation pillar on the east side of the Accord chamber. I had a full line of sight. I watched every second of it unfold, and I remember thinking, around the third or fourth minute, that I was watching something that couldn't possibly end the way it was going, that some kind of intervention would happen, that the room would correct itself. It didn't correct itself. The room just watched. And then Ambassador Yale Doran did something that no one in that chamber, human, Velkari, Sundrick, or otherwise, saw coming. That's the part nobody talks about. That's the part I'm going to tell you. Set up. Velareth 9 is not a beautiful station. I know the travel feeds will tell you otherwise. They'll show you the rotating observation rings, the bioluminescent garden corridors, the triple sunset you can watch through the upper dome every 72 hours. And yes, technically, those things are real. But if you've actually worked on Velareth 9, if you've spent time in the functional sectors where the diplomatic machinery actually runs, the intake halls, the briefing tunnels, the pressurized conference chambers that smell faintly of recycled air and something metallic that nobody's ever quite identified, then you know the truth. It's a working station, ugly and efficient, built for function, not for feeling. It was constructed jointly by humanity and the Sundrick Collective about 40 years before I got there, part of the original Accord framework, which was this very optimistic early attempt to create neutral ground for multi-species diplomacy. The idea being that if no one species owned the station, everyone could feel safe on it. Equal footing, level playing field. That theory works better on paper than in practice, as it turns out. When I arrived, this was about 3 days before the summit officially opened. The station was already humming with pre-conference tension. You could feel it the moment you cleared the entry transit ring. The corridors were packed. Not chaotic, not dangerous, just dense. Delegations from 11 different species moving through the same corridors, each one trailing their own cultural habits and physical requirements, and in some cases, their own atmospheric adjustments. The Velkari travel with a mist generator, always. Their homeworld has a humidity baseline that most other species find suffocating, so they've engineered these portable units, about knee height, dragged on a magnetic sled, that maintain a personal atmospheric bubble around each delegation member. When they walked past you in the corridors, you'd feel this brief, wet warmth, like someone had briefly opened a greenhouse door. The Sundrick were the opposite, dry and sharp, their skin slightly iridescent under standard station lighting, moving in that characteristically precise way of theirs where every step seems calculated. Not robotic, more like extremely deliberate, like they were moving through a space they had already fully modeled in their heads. And then there were humans, which is a funny thing to describe from the outside, but bear with me. From a multispecies protocol perspective, humans are genuinely strange. We vary enormously. Height, coloring, build, even basic behavioral patterns shift from culture to culture in ways that make it hard for other species to build a single model of us. The Velkari, early in the diplomatic relationship, famously spent 6 years trying to figure out whether different human ethnic groups were actually different subspecies, because the physical variation was so much greater than anything they had in their own population. We move differently from each other, we laugh differently, we argue differently, some of us bow, some of us shake hands, some delegations show deference with stillness, others show it with eye contact. To an outside observer, to a young Velkari protocol cadet, say, encountering humans for the first time, we probably looked like barely organized chaos. Which honestly isn't entirely wrong. I was part of the Human Diplomatic Support Corps, which is a more glamorous title than the job actually is. My role at the Velarith 9 Summit was logistics and protocol compliance, making sure the human delegation's movement through the station followed the agreed interspecies etiquette framework, managing scheduling conflicts, and being available as a point of contact if any procedural issue came up that needed immediate resolution. It's the kind of work where everything is fine until it suddenly isn't. The summit itself was structured around 3 main days of session, with the central event being the formal opening of the Galactic Accord expansion talks, a renegotiation of the original framework that had been in place since the founding of the station. 31 years of the existing accord were on the table. New membership terms, new resource-sharing clauses, new protocols around contested transit corridors. Big stuff, the kind of thing that shapes what happens in certain sectors for the next generation. And at the center of it, representing humanity, was Ambassador Yael Doran. I need to tell you about Yael Doran. Not because you need her biography, you don't. But because the thing that happened makes no sense unless you understand who she was and, more importantly, who she appeared to be. Yael Doran was 53 years old. She was Israeli-Canadian by origin, which is relevant only because she'd grown up code-switching between cultures from the time she was a child, and that skill, the ability to read a room across cultural contexts, had become the defining tool of her diplomatic career. She had a reputation that, depending on who you talked to, ranged from formidably effective to absolute nightmare to negotiate against. Both assessments were accurate. She was not physically impressive in the way that some diplomats cultivate as part of their brand. She didn't dress to dominate. She wore standard formal diplomatic attire, clean, well-fitted, understated. Her hair was cut practically short. She wore minimal accessories, a small pin on her left lapel representing the Earth Diplomatic Corps, and a thin bracelet that, as I'd later learn, had been her mother's. She was quiet in spaces. That was the first thing I'd noticed when I was assigned to her detail. She moved through rooms without drawing attention to herself. She'd stand in a corner and watch. For long stretches, she'd just watch, and you'd almost forget she was there. And then she'd turn to you and say something that made you realize she'd been cataloging every interaction in that room for the last 20 minutes. She didn't waste words. She didn't fill silence to be polite. She'd let a silence sit for what felt like an uncomfortably long time, and then she'd say something precise and measured that answered the question in the silence, not the question that had been spoken. It unnerved people who weren't used to it. It drove certain other species absolutely mad. The Velkari, in particular, found her difficult to read. Their own diplomatic culture places enormous emphasis on verbal fluency and expressive communication. Their high-ranking officials speak in these elaborate, flowing registers that signal status and intelligence simultaneously. Silence, in Velkari culture, suggests confusion or submission. A diplomat who used silence strategically would be, to a Velkari, someone who was struggling. To Yael Doran, silence was a tool, one of her best ones. She'd been in galactic diplomacy for 22 years. She had negotiated 3 major transit corridor agreements, helped broker the Sundric Human Science Compact of 2371, and spent 4 years on Velkari Prime as a junior attaché before working her way through a series of increasingly complex postings. She knew the Velkari better than almost any human diplomat alive. She also, as I'd later come to understand, had a level of patience that was almost geological. She could wait a very, very long time. I arrived at the Accord Chamber on the morning of the first formal session, about 40 minutes before the scheduled opening. The chamber itself was one of the original station rooms, large, circular, with tiered seating arranged in a kind of amphitheater configuration around a central floor space where the primary delegates would be positioned. The ceiling was high, domed, fitted with lighting panels that had been calibrated to a neutral spectrum designed to be tolerable for multiple species. Not comfortable for any particular one, but not actively hostile to anyone either. Delegation stations were arranged in a semicircle on the main floor. Human delegation at position 7, Velkari at position 3, Sundrik at position 1 as the senior founding members of the station. Smaller delegations from the Keth, the Oravi, the Far, and 5 others filled in the remaining positions. I was at my observation post, not a delegate, just support, when the Velkari delegation entered. I'd seen General Vorkin Sethel in briefing files. Read the assessments. High-ranking, politically connected, recently elevated from his military command to serve as the head of the Velkari delegation on the strength of his negotiating work in the Herath corridor disputes. He had a strong reputation within Velkari political circles, a reputation built partly on genuine competence and partly, if you read the subtext of the assessments, on a cultivated talent for psychological dominance in negotiating rooms. In person, he was even more deliberately imposing than the files suggested. Velkari physiology is striking anyway. They're tall, on average, and carry themselves with an inherent uprightness that reads, to human eyes, as either regal or menacing depending on context. Their faces are narrower than human faces, with a second pair of eyes set further back along the temple that provides peripheral vision far beyond what humans experience. Their skin runs from pale gray to deep blue-violet, and Vorkin's was a striking dark indigo, almost purple, with faint bioluminescent tracery along his jaw and collarbones that indicated high emotional status among his people. He moved into the room like he owned it. Not rudely. He wasn't barging or imposing his physical presence in an aggressive way. But there was something in the deliberateness of his movement that communicated, without words, that he considered the space to be operating on his terms. He acknowledged the Sundrik delegates at position 1 with the appropriate formal gesture. He nodded, a learned human gesture, notably, toward a couple of the smaller delegations. He did not acknowledge the human delegation station at all on his way to position 3. Not a slight, not necessarily. These things have to be read carefully. Different species have different acknowledgement hierarchies, and within Velkari protocol, the walk to your station is not typically an acknowledgement moment. You reach your station, you set your delegation, and then formal greetings occur through proper channels. But there was something in the way he didn't look at the human delegation, an extra degree of deliberateness to the not looking, like the not looking was the point. I noted it and filed it away. The formal session opened with the Sundrik moderator, a senior diplomat named Assessor Veth, who'd been running interspecies summits for longer than I'd been alive, going through the standard opening procedures. Role of delegations, confirmation of accord framework, statement of session intent. It was the procedural equivalent of clearing your throat. Everybody in the room knew it, but it mattered, because the procedural record of these sessions becomes part of the official Accord archive, and every word of it has weight. Ambassador Doran sat at the human delegation station and listened. She had a small notepad, actual paper, which I always found remarkable, on which she occasionally wrote something. Not constantly, just occasionally. The opening statements began. This is where the first thing happened. Under the standard summit protocol, opening statements from delegations were supposed to follow the order of the seating arrangement. Position 1 through the final position, in sequence. Standard practice, established to ensure equity and avoid any implicit status hierarchy in the order of speaking. General Vorkin Sethel spoke first. Before the Sundrik moderator had finished inviting position 1 to open. Just began speaking. His voice was deep and carries well in enclosed spaces, which is a characteristic of the upper register Velkari vocal range. It filled the chamber cleanly, and his translator array, all delegations wore them, small devices fitted around the ear canal that provided real-time rendering in up to 12 species' primary languages, carried his words clearly to every station. He didn't acknowledge the interruption. He spoke as if the moderator had finished. His statement was well prepared. I'll give him that, covering the Valkyrie positions on the 4 main points of the renegotiation, framed within a kind of historical narrative about the Valkyrie's role in building the Accord framework. Which, technically, was accurate. The Valkyrie had been primary architects of the original framework. But the framing was interesting, because throughout his statement, he described the Accord as something the Valkyrie had built and then extended, generously, to other species. It was subtle enough that you'd need to be paying close attention to catch it. But the implication threading through the language was that the other species at this table were beneficiaries of Valkyrie vision, rather than equal partners in a joint framework. Assessor Veth, the Sundric moderator, waited with the particular stillness of someone choosing not to respond to a provocation. He was good. He'd clearly seen this kind of move before. When Vorkin finished, Veth acknowledged the statement and proceeded to invite Position 1, the Sundric delegation, to open. Smooth, professional. No comment on the interruption, no correction, just a gentle procedural restoration. I glanced at Yale Doran. She was writing something on her notepad. The morning session proceeded. Other delegations offered their opening statements. The Keth spoke about transit concerns. The Orevi raised the resource-sharing clause. The FAR delegation, who are famously terse communicators, stated their position in 4 sentences and then sat back and said nothing further. When it came to the human delegation, Position 7, Yale Doran stood. She spoke for exactly 6 minutes. I know because I was timing it, not out of any particular protocol reason. I just had a habit of timing statements because it helped me track the session pacing. 6 minutes, no notes, no visual aids. Clear, precise, structured, 3 points, each with a specific referencing clause in the existing Accord language, each with a concrete proposal for the expansion language. She sat down. No flourish, no summary statement, just said what she had to say and stopped. It was the cleanest opening statement I'd heard in 3 years of working these sessions. Vorkin Sethel from across the chamber made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was in the category of sounds that Valkyrie make when something strikes them as, and the closest translation is a kind of condescending amusement. Like a small, dismissive exhale that in Valkyrie social communication signals that the speaker considers the previous utterance to have been simplistic. Subtle enough that if you didn't know Valkyrie vocal signaling, you'd miss it entirely. Yale Doran did not look at him. She made a small mark on her notepad. I noted this too. The afternoon session was where things began to shift. It opened with a working discussion on the transit corridor clauses, specifically Clause 7 of the proposed expansion text, which dealt with human shipping lanes through the Herath Belt region. This was contested territory, not in a military sense, but diplomatically. The Valkyrie had existing survey claims in the outer Herath region, and the proposed expansion of human transit routes would overlap with those claims at 3 specific junction points. The issue had a technical solution. Everyone in the room knew it had a technical solution because the working paper circulated prior to the session had laid out 3 different compromise frameworks that would resolve the overlap. The question wasn't whether it could be solved. It was about who would be seen as having yielded ground to get there. Vorkin Sethel opened the discussion by rejecting all 3 proposed frameworks. Not with specific objections, with a general statement that the frameworks were insufficiently developed and that human technical understanding of the Herath region's survey parameters was limited by the relatively brief duration of their deep space presence. That phrase, the relatively brief duration of their deep space presence. I felt something shift in the chamber. It's the kind of phrase that's technically not an insult. It's factually accurate. Humans have been in deep space for around 140 years, which is considerably shorter than the Valkyries' multi-millennium presence. It's true, but deployed in that context, in that tone, with the particular vocal register Vorkin used, the upper status register that implies the speaker is educating someone who doesn't know better, it landed as something else entirely. Several of the smaller delegations went very still. Still in the specific way that species with good political instincts go still when they sense that a moment is moving into dangerous territory, and they're calculating whether to intervene. Ambassador Doran was still looking at the working paper in front of her. Ambassador Doran, Vorkin said, directly addressing her for the first time, still in the upper status register, still with that tone. Perhaps if your delegation would benefit from a more basic explanation of the survey framework, the Valkyrie technical staff can arrange a preparatory session before tomorrow's proceedings. It would not be unusual. Some delegations require additional context. Some delegations. The chamber was absolutely quiet. The Sundrik moderator, Assessor Veth, inhaled once, a very controlled breath that I recognized as a person deciding whether to intervene. Yale Doran looked up from the working paper. She looked directly at Vorkin Sethel. And then she said very calmly, "That's very generous, General. I'll keep it in mind." And she went back to the working paper. The moment just sat there. Vorkin had been ready for a response, something to respond to. The non-response was its own thing, and it took him a fraction of a second longer than it should have to move on. That fraction of a second told me something. I didn't know what yet. The session continued. Vorkin dominated the discussion in the way that a skilled political operator dominates a room, not through volume or aggression, but through sheer quantity of speech. He spoke at length on every point. He spoke with the kind of authority that assumes its own credibility, that builds momentum through consistency. He was polished at it. Every claim he made was technically defensible. Every slight was technically deniable. He referenced human limitations twice more. Once when discussing the resource-sharing clause, something about the human delegation's understandably Earth-centric frame of reference, making certain galactic-scale resource dynamics difficult to grasp. And once, more sharply, when Doran's deputy raised a specific provision about navigation corridor access. That second one was more pointed. He had interrupted the deputy, a younger diplomat named Ren Taekta, mid-sentence. Not a full interruption, just a small one, a quiet interjection that technically redirected the conversation before Taekta had finished his point. And then he'd gone on to present a version of what Taekta was saying, but simplified, as if explaining it back for the room's benefit. Taekta had the very specific expression of a person who is professionally trained not to react. Ambassador Doran was still looking at her notepad. Still writing. By the time the afternoon session closed, I had counted 7 separate incidents. Not all of them were obvious. Some of them were the kind of thing that only registers if you're watching carefully and you know what to look for. But 7, in the course of a single afternoon from a single delegate, aimed consistently at the human delegation, that's not ambient diplomatic friction. That's a campaign. I reported it to my supervisor, a senior protocol officer named Gwen Harada. She already knew. She'd been tracking it separately. "Is Doran aware?" I asked her. Gwen gave me a look. "Davan," she said, "Yale Doran noticed it before you did. She noticed it before I did. She probably noticed it when she read his pre-summit communications 3 weeks ago." "Then why isn't she?" "She will," Gwen said, "in her own time." I didn't understand what that meant yet. That evening, formal sessions were done, but delegates moved through the station's common areas for the informal receptions that are, in many ways, more diplomatically significant than the sessions themselves. I was positioned near the primary reception hall when the second major incident happened. The reception was standard for these events. Atmospheric calibration had been managed as well as possible, which meant it was slightly too warm for most humans and slightly too dry for the Velkari, and broadly acceptable for everyone. Food stations were species-specific, clearly marked. The ambient sound level was being modulated by the station's acoustic management system to stay within a range tolerable for all delegates. It was, in other words, that particular kind of diplomatic event where everyone is doing something carefully and no one is entirely comfortable. And through the collective effort of pretending to be comfortable, a kind of functional comfort is achieved. Ambassador Doran was speaking with a pair of Oravi delegates near the east side of the room. The Oravi, whose primary sensory system is based on sound, are particularly attuned to tone and vocal pattern in communication. They're notoriously good readers of emotional state in other species through pure vocal analysis. Both of them seemed engaged, leaning into the conversation with the slight forward tilt of species that use body orientation as an attentiveness signal. Vorkin Sethel moved through the room in a deliberate path that brought him to the same area. He stopped, greeted the Oravi delegates in the proper form, then turned to Ambassador Doran. "I must say," he said, and this was in the social register, the off-session register, which technically should be a lower-stakes space. "I've had the opportunity to review the Earth Diplomatic Corps briefing documentation on the Herath region. It's quite thorough, given the constraints." Given the constraints. One of the Oravi delegates made a very small sound, not a word, just a sound. "I imagine it's been a challenging posting for you," Vorkin continued. "Multi-species summits of this complexity require a certain depth of preparation that not all delegations are equally positioned to bring." He was smiling. Velkari smiling, which uses a different set of facial muscles than human smiling and produces something that, to a human eye, looks slightly wider than it should. But it was a social expression. It was calibrated to appear friendly. He was publicly, in front of Oravi delegates, suggesting that Ambassador Doran was underprepared for the summit she was attending. "I was already moving." Yale Doran looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. The specific, measured kind of moment that I would later understand was something she did consciously, not instinctively. "Thank you, General," she said. "Preparation is important. I spend a lot of time on it." And then she turned back to the Oravi delegates and continued the conversation she'd been having. Like he wasn't there. I stopped moving because there was nothing to resolve. She had handled it. But what she'd done was something very specific. She had acknowledged his statement without contesting it. She had not become defensive. She had not been visibly rattled, and she had then dismissed him. Politely, but dismissed him. Vorkin Sethel stood there for just under 3 seconds, I counted, and then moved on. But later that night, I was briefed on something by a member of the Sundrik diplomatic staff. The Oravi delegates that Doran had been speaking with, the two who had been leaning in attentively, had, after the exchange, sought out Assessor Veth, privately. What they said to him wasn't disclosed to me in full, but the summary was, they had been tracking the pattern across the full day. And the Oravi, with their particular sensitivity to vocal signals, had told Veth something interesting. General Vorkin Sethel, across every interaction of that day, was broadcasting low-frequency stress signals in his speech patterns, not visible in his behavior, not audible to most species, but there in the sonic texture of his communication, a pattern the Oravi described as consistent with someone who is performing confidence rather than experiencing it. He was under pressure. Something about this summit, or something about Yale Doran specifically, was getting to him in a way his exterior didn't show. The Oravi thought the human delegation should know. I thought about that for a long time before I went to sleep. Morning session. Technical Committee Working Group on the Clause 7 Dispute. Smaller group than the full chamber, 12 delegates rather than the full assembly, with Assessor Veth moderating, and a technical working paper on the table that had been revised overnight. Ambassador Doran had submitted proposed language for the revision. It had arrived in the document management system at 3:40 in the morning, station time. I want to tell you what she had actually done, because the reporting afterward consistently undersold it. The original dispute, remember, this was the 3 transit corridor junction points in the Herath Belt where human shipping lanes would overlap with Valkyrie survey claim boundaries, had been presented by Vorkin as a binary problem. Either the human routes stayed within their current boundary, which didn't achieve what the expansion talks were meant to achieve, or they crossed into survey claim territory, which the Valkyrie were positioning as an unacceptable intrusion. 2 options, both bad for different parties. What Doran had done overnight was go back into the original survey claim documentation, not the summary. The original documentation, which is a multilingual archive going back 40 years that almost nobody reads because it's enormously dense and formatted in 3 different classification systems, depending on when each section was filed. And she had found something. The Valkyrie survey claims in the outer Herath region, specifically at 2 of the 3 disputed junction points, had been filed under a provisional designation, not a full claim, a provisional one. The distinction matters because under Accord framework law, provisional claims have a renewal cycle, and at the time the original accord was negotiated, the provisional designation for those 2 junction points had been renewed under a set of terms that included a negotiated transit provision, a buried clause that explicitly reserved the right of other accord members to request transit corridor consideration through provisional claim zones. It was 40 years old. It had never been invoked. It was in the archive, and almost certainly had never been read by anyone who was currently at this table. But it was there, and Yale Doran had found it, at 3:40 in the morning, and she had drafted proposed language for the Clause 7 revision that cited it by reference, by archive location, and by the specific subclause in the original provisional agreement. She had spent the night reading 40 years of survey documentation. When the working group session opened and Assessor Veth introduced the revised working paper with her proposed language, Vorkin Sethel picked up the document and began reading it. I was watching his face, or rather, I was watching the 2 standard eyes visible to me, since his temple-set eyes were angled slightly away. And something changed in the set of his expression. Very small, but I caught it. He recognized what she'd found. The proposed language references a provisional designation that the Valkyrie delegation will need to review, he said. His voice had shifted slightly, still controlled, still in the authoritative register, but something in the rhythm was different. Of course, Assessor Veth said. How much time does the delegation require for review? There was a pause, just a beat too long. An hour, Vorkin said. The session recessed. I found Yale Doran in the corridor outside the working group room, standing near a viewport that looked out at the station's secondary docking ring. She was holding a cup of what I assumed was coffee, but which I'd later learn was a specific tea she'd been drinking for 30 years. He didn't know, I said, keeping my voice low. She looked at me with the expression of someone who found the statement mildly amusing, but was too polite to say so directly. He knew the provisional designation existed, she said. He's too good not to have known that, but he assumed it wouldn't be found, or he assumed that by the time anyone found it, the summit would be substantially over. How long were you planning this? She drank some tea. I read the original archive when I was first assigned to this posting, she said, 14 months ago. 14 months. Then why wait until last night? I asked. She looked out at the docking ring. A supply shuttle was moving in slow rotation toward the magnetic coupling point on the outer ring. She watched it for a moment. Because if I'd cited it in the pre-session briefings, she said, he'd have had months to find a counter-argument, or to pressure the Sundrik to reinterpret the provisional terms, or to build a coalition around a new position. Now he has an hour, and in an hour he can confirm that I'm right, or he can claim he needs more time, which costs him credibility in front of every other delegation in that room. She turned back to me. Yale, I said, and I wasn't sure what I was going to say after that. He chose the terms, she said very simply. He spent yesterday making the case in front of 11 delegations that humanity doesn't understand the Accord framework well enough to negotiate on equal terms. That was his argument. That was his position. She paused. I just responded to it. The session resumed after 53 minutes. Not an hour, 53 minutes. Which meant the Valkyrie technical staff had worked fast and hard and still needed 7 fewer minutes than requested, which told you something about how urgent they'd found the review. Vorkin Sethel returned to the table with a very carefully constructed expression of composure. He acknowledged the proposed language. He did not contest the archive citation. He proposed a minor modification to the transit provision wording, a cosmetic adjustment, really, that didn't change the substance, and framed it as a collaborative refinement of the proposal. Assessor Veth noted the modification. It was incorporated, the clause advanced. There was no dramatic moment. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no film-worthy standoff. It was a diplomatic session, and in diplomatic sessions, victories happen in the texture of language and in the way people sit and the words they choose. But every delegation in that room knew what had just happened. And Vorkin Sethel knew that they knew. But I'm not done, because that was the morning, and the morning was the setup for the afternoon. Because something changed in Vorkin Sethel after the recess. I can only describe it as the behavior of a man who has decided that precision isn't working and that he needs to try something different, something more direct. It was a mistake, a significant one, and I think the RFE reading of him, the stress indicators, the performance rather than the experience of confidence, goes some way toward explaining why he made it. The afternoon session moved to Clause 12, which was the membership extension provision, the part of the expansion talks that would determine which new species could apply for Accord membership and under what terms. This was the section that, from a pure galactic politics perspective, had the most long-term significance. The transit corridors mattered. The resource clauses mattered. But membership extension would shape the power balance of the Accord for the next 50 years. The Valkyrie position on membership extension, as Vorkin had framed it in pre-session documents, was that new membership should require a minimum of 300 years of verifiable deep space presence and a demonstrated history of interspecies diplomatic engagement at the formal treaty level, both of which were, as anyone at the table could calculate, thresholds that would exclude approximately 8 of the 12 species currently applying for membership consideration. The human position, as submitted by the Doran delegation, was that the threshold criteria should be based on demonstrated treaty capacity and existing Accord-compatible governance structures rather than duration of deep space presence, because duration is an artifact of history, not a measure of diplomatic competence. You can see where this was going. Vorkin opened the afternoon by restating the Valkyrie position on membership extension criteria, and then, in a move that I am still, years later, somewhat astonished by, he said this. The question of duration matters because it reflects something real. Species that have been navigating multi-species dynamics for 300 years have developed frameworks of understanding that newer participants simply do not yet have. We see this at this very table. The human delegation, representing a species with barely a century and a half of deep space experience, faces, As we have observed across these sessions, real challenges in accessing and applying the full depth of Accord precedent. This is not criticism. It is simply reality. The criteria exist to protect the quality of the Accord, not to exclude. He looked directly at Yale Doran as he said it. The chamber had gone very still. What he had just done was take the morning's defeat and reframe it. He had turned the moment when Doran had outmaneuvered him in the archives into evidence for his own position. Had said, essentially, that it took her all night and it was still barely enough. And this is why new species need time before they're ready for the table. It was a skilled rhetorical move. I'll give him that. It required a certain boldness, using a loss as the evidence for your argument. And he was right that it would land with some of the other delegations. The Sundrick had their own version of duration as credibility thinking. The older species generally did. He was expecting Doran to contest the framing, to argue about the definition of challenges, to defend the morning. She didn't. What she did instead was wait. Assessor Veth offered her the floor, and she stood up, and she did something I had never seen a diplomat do in a formal session. She introduced evidence. Not an argument, evidence. She had her deputy Ren Taekta bring up a display screen, which under session protocol required prior authorization, which meant she'd had it pre-authorized that morning, which meant she'd anticipated this specific turn in the conversation, and the screen showed a timeline. Just a timeline. Simple graphic. Species across the top. Time markers going back 3,000 years down the left side. The timeline showed the history of every significant multi-species conflict in this region of the galaxy over the past 3,000 years. Wars, territorial disputes, resource conflicts, treaty breakdowns. The kind of events that the Accord framework had been designed in part to prevent. She highlighted every conflict in which a Velkari-led position or Velkari strategic decision had been a contributing factor. There were many. Not all of them, not most of them, but there were many, and they were documented with archive references, with the same kind of precision she'd applied to the provisional survey claims that morning. Duration of deep space presence, she said, is not a measure of judgment, it's a measure of time. She indicated the timeline. 3,000 years of deep space experience can include 3,000 years of learning. It can also include 3,000 years of making certain categories of error. She didn't say who was making those errors. She didn't have to. She continued. The proposed membership criteria in the expansion text should measure what species are capable of, not how long they've been in the room, because length of time in the room by itself doesn't mean what General Sethel is suggesting it means. She sat down. The chamber was completely quiet. And then Vorkin Sethel made his biggest mistake. Because he was rattled. He had been rattled since the morning, and the Orevi had been right, and he was performing confidence that he no longer felt, and under that pressure he said something that he had, I believe, successfully suppressed for 2 days. He said, Ambassador Doran's grasp of Accord history is interesting, given that humanity spent most of that history as a species that had not yet left its own atmosphere. He said it with the social register's light contempt, the kind of thing designed to sting. But the thing he didn't know, or forgot, in the moment, was that this chamber had live Accord session recording. That everything said in formal session became part of the permanent diplomatic record. That every delegate in this room, and every review body and archive committee and future diplomatic cohort that would study this summit would have access to what he just said. He had, in an official Accord session, on the record, insulted the human species' entire history of development. Not the human delegation. Not the human diplomatic position, the species. The Sundrick moderator set down his notepad. Several delegates made sounds, not human sounds, but the various species equivalents of a sharp intake of breath. Yale Doran sat very still. And then she did the thing that I still think about. She turned to Assessor Veth, and she said formally, invoking the session protocol reference, "Assessor, I request that General Sethel's previous statement be read back into the record with explicit notation," which under Accord session law means flag it permanently for the archive. Veth held General Vorkin Sethel's gaze for a moment, and then he said, "Noted, Ambassador Doran, the record will reflect." Vorkin Sethel said nothing. What could he say? He had just, in a formal Accord session that would be reviewed by every species diplomatic corps and archived for future generations, called humanity, not individual humans, but the species unworthy of the table because they had once been planet-bound. As had, incidentally, every other species at that table, at some point in their history, every single one, including the Velkari. The rest of the afternoon session was quiet. Not tense, not hostile, just quiet in the way that rooms get quiet after something significant has happened and everyone is waiting to understand what it means. Vorkin Sethel did not speak again for the remainder of the session. His deputy spoke on procedural points, but the general himself sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him and did not engage. After the session closed, Assessor Veth requested a private meeting with the Velkari delegation. I was not in that meeting, obviously, but I was told, by someone who was in a position to know, that the meeting lasted approximately 40 minutes and that Veth had used the specific formal register of Sundric diplomatic language reserved for situations where a host institution is formally noting a breach of conduct. Not a sanction. The Accord doesn't work on sanctions at this level, but a notation, an on-the-record acknowledgement from the body managing the summit that certain conduct had occurred and would be formally recognized as such. In diplomatic terms, that's significant. It shapes the record. It shapes how the summit is characterized in every subsequent review. Every junior diplomat who studies this summit, and summits of this importance do get studied, will know that the Sundric moderator issued a formal breach notation to the Velkari delegation on day 2. What it means in practical terms took a few days to fully manifest. 2 things happened over the final day of the summit. First, the Velkari delegation dropped the 300-year threshold for membership criteria. Not entirely, but substantially. They agreed to a negotiated framework that set capability-based criteria alongside a more modest duration threshold, which was precisely what the human delegation had originally proposed. The final language read as a compromise, because diplomatically it needed to, but anyone who knew the original positions understood that it was a substantive concession. Second, 3 of the delegations that had been observing the summit from neutral positions, the Keth, the Far, and one of the smaller species whose name doesn't translate cleanly but who were considering Accord membership themselves, all submitted formal follow-up communications in the days after the summit noting their appreciation for the human delegation's thorough and consistent approach to the substantive archive work underlying the expansion discussion. Which is the diplomatic equivalent of saying, "We saw what happened and we noticed." I caught Yale Doran in the corridor outside the departure transit ring on the last morning of the summit. She was with Ren Taikta, and they were going through something on a document scroll, probably the final session notes. I asked her something I'd been thinking about for 2 days. "You knew he was going to do it," I said. "Not the specific words, but you knew he was going to say something like that." She looked up from the scroll. "I thought he might," she said. "Under enough pressure, and in a room where he'd been performing confidence he didn't feel, and facing an audience that was starting to see through the performance, yes. I thought there was a real possibility he'd reach for something blunt. And you wanted it on the record." "I wanted whatever he was actually thinking to be on the record," she said. "People can mask a diplomatic position indefinitely, but what they actually believe about the people they're negotiating with, that's harder to mask. Eventually it shows. She paused. The membership criteria he was proposing would have kept 8 species out of the Accord based on a threshold that was really about something else entirely. About his view of which species deserve to be at the table and which ones are guests. That needed to be visible. Not because it helps the human delegation, it does, but that's not the point. It needed to be visible because the other delegations applying for membership deserved to know what the opposition to them was actually based on. I thought about the keth, the HFY, the small species whose name didn't translate, species who'd come to this summit wondering what their chances were of building a secure future within the Accord framework. She did something for them, Rentakta said quietly without looking up from his document scroll, not explaining it further, just saying it. Yeah, she did. I went back to Velarith 9 twice more in the years after. Different summits, different contexts, the usual work. The station still smelled faintly of recycled air and that unidentified metallic something that nobody'd ever explained to my satisfaction. The Velkari delegation at those subsequent summits was led by different people. I don't know what happened to Vorkin Sethel's career after Velarith 9. That kind of information doesn't always make it into the reports that reach my level. But I know his name appears in the summit record with a formal notation attached. And I know the HFY diplomatic corps, those extraordinary listeners, those readers of the sounds beneath words, circulated an internal analysis of the summit that became something of a training document in their system for understanding what they call the difference between authority and confidence. Yale Doran continued as a diplomat for another 11 years after Velarith 9. She negotiated 4 more major agreements. She never, as far as I could find in any record, raised her voice in a formal session. She didn't need to. Because what I learned that day, standing at my observation post in the east section of Accord Chamber 7, watching a 53-year-old woman with a paper notepad dismantle a campaign of contempt with 40 years of archived survey documentation and 12 minutes of formally on-the-record silence, is something I've tried to hold on to. The galaxy does not give respect, not to individuals, not to species, not to the newcomers still learning the coordinates, still mapping the corridors, still figuring out which protocols matter and which ones are theater. The galaxy has to be shown. Not with force, not with volume. With the particular, patient, devastating competence of someone who read the archive at 3 in the morning 14 months before anyone else knew what was at stake. That's what Yale Doran did in that room. And General Vorkin Sethel's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating her. His biggest mistake was doing it out loud.